In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate 3 approaches for decreasing while maintaining a cable pattern. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. I have quite a collection of hand-knit cabled sweaters. And each sweater is slightly different from the other sweaters, but they all have one thing in common, and that is that at some point I had to decrease stitches while maintaining the cable pattern. And I did it in different ways using a combination of techniques dependent on the specific garment that I was knitting. So today I'm going to show you some of the techniques that I use when I'm knitting cabled sweaters that allow me to maintain the stitch pattern while I'm knitting. What I have here is a swatch with 3 cables, and each of these cables are worked with 2 stitches crossing 2 other stitches to the right. And now I started out where there was a purl column on each side of the cable, and then there was a 2-stitch column of knits. And for each of these 3 cables, what I have done to the right is I've begun working decreases, and I continued to work my cables while I was doing that. But now I'm at the point where I've eliminated the purl column between the stitches, and I'm ready to work another decrease, but it's also a cable crossing row. So I'm going to show you 3 different ways that I could approach this. So I've decreased over here, but I've also done the same decreasing here and also here. So I'm going to show you 3 different ways of continuing to decrease while I've got this cable pattern going. So the first approach that I have is that now that I'm going to be decreasing into the stitches that make up the cable, that I'll just stop crossing the cable altogether. I'll just work this in stockinette stitch. And this is a very common method of dealing with decreasing while working in cables. So I'll work the decrease that I would normally, that I've been working, which is an SSK, left leaning decrease. So I've eliminated that stitch, and I've only got 3 stitches left, so I'm not going to do the cable crossing in here. I'm just going to work these stitches as stockinette. So here's a sweater in which I was working cables up the front, and then because I needed to work decreases to create the V-neck, I had to stop working the cable crossings. And you'll notice that both of these cables are crossing to the left. They are not mirrored in this example. They're both crossing to the left. And I continue to decrease right up here next to the edge. And this was all just maintained in stockinette stitch all the way up. And in this case, after this final crossing, the neckline was encroaching in on these stitches, and they just continued on in stockinette. And again, here I have mirrored cables, and I have a raglan sleeve decrease that's going on, so you can see my line of decrease stitches here, and you can see where the cables have just been worked in stockinette, and this is quite a long stretch of stockinette without a cable crossing. So in this next situation, I am going to not decrease before I get to the 4 cable stitches, the stitches that are to be cabled. I'm just going to work these 2 stitches as they are in stockinette. And this time I'm going to cross my cable and work a decrease at the same time. So this is a right crossing cable. I'm going to put my first 2 stitches on the cable needle and hold it to the back. And now I'm going to work the first 2 stitches on my left needle. Now this stitch is going to be all the way over on the right, and this second stitch is going to be kind of in the middle, and that's where the decrease is going to occur. So I'm going to work that first stitch just as normal. And then I'm going to work the second stitch together with the first stitch on the cable needle. So it's going to be a knit two together where I'm working this stitch together with the first stitch on the cable needle. It's a knit two together. So that one comes off the needle, and then that one comes off. So we've worked that as a knit two together, and now I can work the second stitch that's on the cable needle. It looks like the regular cable crossing has been worked. I've got 2 stitches crossing over the top, but I've only got 1 stitch resulting on the back, and I didn't have to work a decrease right here. So I was able to keep this cable crossing going while I did that. Sometimes your cables are crossing to the left, and so I want to show you how you would decrease when you're crossing to the left instead of to the right. So in this case, I have 3 stitches crossing 3 stitches to the left, and so I'm going to slip 3 stitches onto the cable needle, and these get held to the front because these are the stitches that are going to cross to the left. Now in this case, we're going to be working off the back stitches first, and the first 2 stitches are going to be over to the far right, and the last stitch here is the one that's going to be in the center. I'm going to work these 2 stitches first, and so now we want to decrease out this stitch, so we're going to decrease it together with the first stitch on the front needle. And then we can finish working off of the cable needle. I'm going to show you something that's very similar to this, but it's worked a little bit differently. I'm going to work that first knit stitch. So this is the column where I have been working the decrease. So I'm going to go ahead and work my decrease, my SSK. So I've eliminated one of the stitches for the cable, and I still have 3 stitches, but now what I can do is work the cable crossing as 2 stitches crossing over 1 stitch. So I take the 1 stitch and move it to the back. I work these 2 stitches, and then I work the stitch off the back needle. So in this kind of situation, I happen to be doing the decrease on the same row that I did this cable crossing, but if I was to have done the decrease maybe a couple of rows earlier, so that when I got to this row, and maybe I didn't need to do a decrease at this point, but I only had the 3 stitches there, I could do this. And so what I'm doing is I'm maintaining the number of stitches that I had crossing originally, and what's crossing behind is only 1 stitch. That's where I'm reducing the stitch count. So those are some options for that kind of situation where you can keep the cable crossing going a little bit longer than you could if you were just switching to stockinette as soon as you didn't have as many stitches. So let me show you some examples of that situation. So this is an example of a V-neck sweater where I have this sort of consistent cable lace pattern going across the entire width of the front. And the V-neck is encroaching in on the cables and the lace pattern. So these cables are 3 stitches crossing 3 stitches. And as the neckline began to encroach on that, I started reducing the number of stitches that were involved in the cable crossing because I had fewer stitches. I didn't switch to stockinette. I kept these cable crosses going, and I kept them going for quite a while. You can see I still have 3 stitches crossing 3 here, then I have 3 crossing 2 here, and then I have 2 crossing 2 here, and then I finally just switched to working in stockinette. And then I started encroaching in on the lace pattern, but I kept that going as well. With lace patterns, there's often a similar instruction to just switch to stockinette when you start encroaching in on the area where the lace pattern is. But if I had done that with this particular sweater, when I got to this point, I would have switched to stockinette and I would have worked all of this in stockinette, and then I would have switched this to stockinette and I would have worked all of that in stockinette. So I would have had just a large sort of triangular, narrowing triangular, widening triangular area of stockinette adjacent to the entire neckline, and that wouldn't have been as attractive, I don't think, as continuing to the cable crossings as long as I could, even though the cable crossings themselves were narrowing. I felt that was a more attractive option than to just switch to stockinette. Here's one more V-neck sweater where I have a cable pattern, but in this case I have one cable pattern that isn't terribly wide, but it runs up the either side of the front of the sweater, and then I start needing the decreases for the V-neck. So if I had started encroaching in on this pattern, it would have just disappeared, and that wouldn't have looked very attractive. So what I chose to do here was to move my decreases. So I'm not decreasing in the cable area at all. Instead, I moved the decreases to the right of this cable here and to the left on the other side. And then I did my decreases over here. So what you'll see here is over here at the edge of the sleeve, I have a line of decreases here, and these decreases have that defined line where I'm leaning the decreases toward the area changing in size. But over here, I'm decreasing adjacent to purl columns that I'm maintaining. And I just have a personal preference that when I'm doing something like that, that I lean my decreases away from the area changing in size. So in both cases, these decreases are leaning this way, and they're doing different things for different purposes that I have aesthetic preferences for. This isn't the right way to do it. It is one way to do it. And you might instead, if you were in this situation, you might choose to take this column of knit stitches right here and maintain them as a frame for the rest of them and have the decreases leaning that way. But that's an option. It's just moving the decreases over in order to maintain a panel of cables along a neckline. I have an endless supply of gray cabled sweaters, it seems. So this is a sleeve where I had cables all over of different types, and I was knitting the sleeve from the shoulder down, so I needed to decrease the cables. These are kind of dark, so it may be a little hard to see, but here I have a cable that's actually composed of side-by-side cables. These are rope cables, like a right crossing cable here and a left crossing cable here, and when you put them side by side, they kind of look like a wishbone. And so as I was getting closer to the seam line here, what I would do is I would continue crossing, and then I would keep decreasing over here. And so this is 2 stitches crossing 2 stitches here, and then I decreased enough and I only had 3 stitches left, so I did 2 stitches crossing 1 here, and then this part I just switched to stockinette while I maintain this part here as long as possible. And you'll see I did the same thing over here where I continued to cross for a little bit, and then that part went to stockinette while the other crossing, that's the other half of that cable, continued to the left. What I showed you today were methods for handling the sorts of decrease shaping situations you might typically encounter while working a sweater with a cable stitch pattern. These are not the only ways to handle these situations, and these are not the only scenarios in which you might need to decrease while maintaining a cable pattern. One of the sweaters I showed you had cables that crossed in the same direction on both sides of the neck. Another had mirrored cables that crossed away from the neck, and the vest with the cable lace pattern had mirrored cables that crossed toward the neck. I find that the cables that cross toward the neck are the best candidates for continuing to work the cable crossings as the stitch count decreases. You don't need special charting software to plan out your decrease strategy. You can use graph paper and a pencil to help map out your cables and plan how you're going to combine the various techniques I showed you today. Trying out these techniques on swatches can be a great way to learn more about which techniques you prefer and which ones work best for your project. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.